On plantations, what made it into enslaved people's hands were leftovers: pig's feet, corn husks, bitter greens, roots, and whatever could be gathered in secret. Even so, out of almost nothing, a resistance cuisine was born, one that still shapes what America eats, even though it barely shows up in the books. It wasn't just food, it was a strategy to stay alive, day after day. Now we're going to open up this story and present 25 survival foods and the rarely told origins of dishes that are still on your table. Stick with me, because some of them change the way you see all of this. 1. Toasted corn, dry kernels roasted. In times of hunger in the fields, there wasn't always a fire or a pot to cook food. The move was to toast the dry kernels until they popped, turning into something you could eat straight from hand to mouth. For enslaved people, it was both baggage and shield. It fit in a pocket, didn't spoil easily, and could keep you going for days. It was their trail mix, but not for a hike, for making it through back-breaking work from sunup to sundown. A lot of the time, it was the only thing in your stomach until nightfall. Today, we recognize that past in popcorn-style corn at a street market or a little bag of toasted corn from a gas station. But back then, it didn't look like a snack. It was about staying on your feet. And from that bare minimum resource, part of Southern food tradition was born. But what happened when the corn simply ran out? 2. Cooked cornmeal mush. Cooked cornmeal mush was the hot meal that kept your body upright after a full day of forced labor. Just cornmeal, water, and salt stirred over the fire until it turned into a thick porridge. No milk, no fat, no comfort, just the minimum to fool the hunger. Accounts from enslaved people repeat that scene night after night. A lot of the time, the mush was dumped into wooden troughs, and children would crowd around, eating side by side, pressed together, treated like animals. Harsh, humiliating, but it's what made sure they saw the next day. The next day, whatever was left, hardened, was cut into strips and fried in fat, turning into something close to polenta cakes. Cook once, fry later. That was the math of survival. Stretch the portion, waste nothing, pull one more meal out of that same handful of corn. 3. Turnip greens. When meat was missing, and it was almost always missing, enslaved families leaned on whatever the land would give. Turnip greens, bitter and tossed aside by so many, became the base of stews that kept people alive. They went into the pot, cooked a long time, and got only what was available: a pinch of salt and, if luck showed up, a little saved fat guarded like treasure. This wasn't celebration food. It was a plan to get through the day. That green fed you and warmed you when the cold cut through thin clothes inside nearly empty cabins. Over time, tricks showed up to tame the bitterness. Low heat, mixed-in roots, any scrap that came around. That practice crossed generations and still echoes today in the South, next to cornbread, and the next spoonful shows what else was hiding in that pot. 4. Black-eyed pea stew. Long before it showed up on New Year's tables, it was already fuel for people living on plantations. Enslaved Africans crossed the ocean carrying the cowpea in memory, a tough bean that could handle heat, poor soil, and neglect. Cheap, full of protein, it became a meal when meat existed only in your mind. The cooking was straightforward. Boil until soft, a little salt, maybe a chunk of pork, some herbs gathered from the woods. But most of the time it was just beans and water. What looked like nothing but survival food was also memory. That same bean had already thickened porridges and stews in African villages. There, in the middle of violence, every spoonful was a way to hold on to your own story. Today, when black-eyed peas hit the plate with rice or turn into Hoppin' John, that past is still simmering right along with them. 5. Boiled dandelion greens. When you hear dandelion, you might only think of a weed you pull out of the yard. But for enslaved people, those leaves were a gift from the earth. They grew on their own, with no care, and filled the pot when the pantry was already empty. Boiled until tender, they lost some of their bitterness and, if you were lucky, got vinegar or a thread of fat. Most of the time it was just leaf and water, thin broth, tough bites, just enough to trick hunger. Still, they brought iron, vitamins, energy. Cooks knew that weed was both food and medicine. In the U.S. South, it stayed on the table into the 20th century and now comes back as an expensive superfood on fancy menus. What used to be desperation food now costs a few dollars a bunch. And if even a bitter weed could become a meal, imagine the impact when sugar rarely showed up in those same kitchens. 6. Water with molasses, the sweet ration drink. On plantations, sugar was money, and enslaved people almost never tasted it. Sometimes, though, they were given molasses, dark, thick, sticky. It wasn't luxury, but it was sweetness, and that mattered. To make it last, they'd mix 1 spoon into 10 cups of water. It turned into a cheap energy drink, quick calories, and a moment of flavor in a hard life. For kids, it was a rare treat. For adults, fuel to face the fields. When a cough tightened up or a stomach acted up, it could be taken with herbs as a home remedy. And the echo is still here. That sweetness made its way into southern baked goods, sauces, and desserts, helping shape a whole region's palate. But if molasses was rare, the next food came from the opposite, scraps the owners threw away. That would become a dish. 7. Salted pork scraps, fried or boiled. Salted pork scraps were what was left after enslavers kept the hams, chops, and roasts. For the enslaved, it was fat, skin, and tough trimmings. In a hot pot, those pieces released fat that became seasoning for beans, greens, cornmeal mush. In long, simmered pots, the hardened meat softened and fooled hunger for a few hours. Salt pork was never a generous gift. It was cheap, lasted a long time, and was seen as unfit for high-status tables. Still, in black hands, it became the backbone of a survival kitchen, that salty, smoky touch running through a plate and making leftovers feel like a feast. Today, that past lives on in Southern soul food. Collards cooked with a ham bone, cabbage sautéed with bacon, thick stews of squash and wild greens holding whole families together. 8. Squash and wild greens stew. When food got scarce, enslaved cooks searched out what the land left behind. Squash that sprouted on its own, rough leaves pulled from the woods, anything that could go into the pot. Out of that came a thick stew that was more about staying alive than celebrating. The squash brought sweetness and staying power. The greens, tough and sturdy, filled out the bottom of the pot. Sometimes it was just water and salt. On lucky days, a bit of fat or an onion went in. Nothing was wasted. From that humble mix came a lesson in skill and resistance that echoes in southern soups, fall stews, and the way greens are cooked down into comfort. Direct inheritance from that survival pontage. And the seeds, toasted and salted, became a handheld snack, small reserves of energy to get through the day. 9. Toasted pumpkin seeds. When the flesh went into the pot, nothing was wasted. The seeds were washed, dried, and toasted on the coals by enslaved people. With a little salt, if there was any, they became a rare, crunchy snack. It wasn't just taste. There was protein and fat, rare in a diet built on grains and greens. For kids, a handful could be the difference between going to sleep with an empty stomach or with some relief. It was survival food born from what the big house ignored and the captive kitchen turned into something useful. That instinct to save and reuse stuck. Today, toasted pumpkin seeds show up in snack packs, in salads, in health food stores. What used to be a strategy against hunger now costs money. And while the seeds became a little treat, slow-roasted turnip root guaranteed another kind of sustenance, soft enough to play the role of bread or meat. 10. Roasted turnip root. When bread was a luxury and meat lived only in imagination, this root became what you had to stay on your feet. Pulled from the ground, scrubbed fast, and tossed into the coals, it stopped being hard and bitter and turned soft and slightly sweet. In the quarters, it was filling food, the answer to hunger when the cornmeal disappeared. Sometimes it went in whole, sometimes mashed or sliced thin and fried in pork fat, if anything was left. The potato of people with nothing, the bread of people determined to survive. And even so, roasting brought a smoky smell that felt like a gift. It wasn't just food, it was warmth in your hand, company around the fire. Out of that improvisation came habits that crossed generations, all the way to Southern tables, church lunches, and celebrations. And while turnips quieted urgent hunger, another dish showed up, a mashed mix of corn and okra that stitched Africa's memory into the flavor. 11. Mashed okra and corn. Okra and corn together make a combination that carries a deep story. Okra, though it isn't native to the Americas, arrived through slave ships, carried in memories and seeds hidden in cloth. Once planted in the South, it found ideal ground to grow. In the hands of enslaved cooks who blended African culture with a new environment, mashed okra and corn was born, a simple dish, but essential for survival. This thick stew, sometimes sticky, was made with sliced okra and ground corn, a staple of the diet. On nights with no leftover meat, the dish held up with those two main ingredients. But beyond being food, each bite preserved cultural memory. Dishes like gumbo, succotash, and other Southern staples still echo that heritage. What started as a way to resist and survive became a symbol of identity. Still, in times of scarcity, foraging in the woods, like gathering persimmons, also became vital to keeping life going. 12. Persimmons gathered, mashed, or eaten raw. In plantation times, sweetness was rare at the table, and every ripe persimmon felt like treasure. They grew wild through southern woods, quiet orange fruit, until someone bit one too early and felt their mouth clamp up from all that astringency. All it took was the first frost for them to soften and turn sweet. Enslaved families knew that secret. They picked persimmons late in the season, ate them raw, mashed them into pulp, dried them into thin sheets to carry in a pocket, or mixed them into water, making a simple drink, like a light molasses. It wasn't just food, it was knowledge of season and land, the difference between a bitter mistake and a rare moment of pleasure. Even today, persimmons still show up in southern yards, becoming puddings, breads, and homemade wine, while the foundation of survival kept being broken grains and leftover rice scraps that held no value for enslavers. 13. Broken rice porridge. On Carolina plantations, rice built fortunes, but the people working the fields almost never saw whole, polished grains. For enslaved families, what was left were the middlings, broken fragments from milling. The best part went to the big house. The rest came back in smaller sacks. Cooked in water, it made a thin porridge. Sometimes it got salt, beans, or greens, but often it was just rice and liquid. It didn't last in your stomach, but it still gave strength for one more shift. And there was knowledge in that. Many enslaved Africans already understood rice cultivation and cooking back home and knew how to pull sustenance from what looked like scraps, keeping habits and memory alive too. That way of stretching rice became the base of soups and porridges in the South, and when rice ran out, the search kept going into the woods after vine fruits that stained your fingers purple. 14. Wild muscadine grapes. Deep in southern woods, vines hid a treasure that never made it into the owner's baskets. Muscadine grapes, thick-skinned and bursting with juice. They were uneven fruit, sometimes sour, other times so sweet they felt like a reward from the woods. For enslaved families, finding a cluster meant tasting abundance. Kids picked fast, hands stained purple, while adults mashed, strained, boiled, trying to save that flavor in juices and syrups for when food got scarce. But the bigger value wasn't only in what eased hunger. Muscadines grew outside the plantation's control, in thickets where the whip didn't rule. Following those vines was, quietly, choosing your own path. Today, they become jams, wines, bottles lined up on shelves. But the next food in this story wasn't born free in the woods. It came from the slaughterhouse, a cow's tongue rejected by many. 15. Boiled beef tongue. On the plantation, the best cuts almost never reached the quarters. When a cow was slaughtered, what sometimes got left behind was the tongue, tough, fatty, seen as a scrap. But enslaved cooks wasted nothing. They cleaned the tongue, kept it on the fire for hours until it softened, and sliced it very thin. Sometimes it got salt, vinegar, some simple seasoning. Often, nothing beyond a pot and time. Even so, it was relief, a rare source of protein and fat in a routine built on grains and greens. For people constantly stretching corn and vegetables just to fill a belly, having meat, even tongue, felt like a small victory. And what started as a survival strategy became a valued dish, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to tongue sandwiches in New York, while so many people kept turning the mill with the same corn as always. 16. Cracked corn grits. Broken corn, no luxury. For enslaved people, there was one ingredient that almost never disappeared: corn. Ground fine, it became mush. In bigger pieces, it became grits. The process was simple: water on the fire, corn in the pot, wait until it swelled and turned into a firm porridge. No butter, no cream, no cheese, just corn and water. It wasn't pleasure, it was fuel. It filled you up, needed little firewood, could be made in one pot, and cost very little. That's why it came back to the table morning or night, marking the routine of survival. Over time, outside the quarters, it became a foundation of Southern cooking and gained seasoning, milk, gravy. Today it shows up with shrimp or cheese, but the root is different. A plain bowl keeping bodies alive in impossible conditions. And when hunger wasn't the only emergency, the search for relief went back to the woods, where sassafras roots became tea. 17. Sassafras root tea. When water wasn't enough, enslaved families looked to the woods for something that brought flavor and support. They dug up sassafras root, washed it, chopped it, and put it over the fire. Out of the boil came an earthy tea with a touch of sweetness, served in the rare pauses between one shift and the next. It wasn't just enjoyment. Many believed the hot cup soothed coughs, helped with fever, and offered relief when medicine didn't exist. In that pot, there was memory too. Enslaved cooks blended herb knowledge brought from Africa with what they learned from indigenous peoples, mixing practices to keep going. Centuries later, that taste crossed time and helped inspire root beer, even though its origin wasn't a bottled drink. And while some roots became an infusion, other foods were kept in brine, cucumbers, peppers, to face months of scarcity. 18. Pickled cucumbers and peppers. Cucumbers and peppers soaked in brine became a vital resource in enslaved people's quarters. Since fresh food spoiled fast, preserving was the way to extend what the garden gave. With salt, water, and a little time, whoever was at the stove sliced the vegetables, packed them into jars or barrels, and covered everything with the mixture. Then you waited. Time did the work, and in a few days the crunch softened, but the flavor showed up, sour, salty, and, when peppers went in, with heat. Next to corn mush or bitter greens, that bite changed the meal. And there was something bigger. When the fields stopped producing, those stored jars became proof there would still be food the next day. No surprise, the South kept that memory alive in relishes and other pickles. And when the garden failed, the search kept going beyond the yard, where even black walnuts demanded patience. 19. Gathered black walnuts. Black walnuts on the forest floor looked like nothing but a hard shell and stain that won't come off. Anyone who's tried to crack one knows. It's work. It takes a rock or a hammer, and the nut hides inside. But for enslaved families, every strike had a purpose. When the shell gave way, there was a reserve of protein and fat, with a stronger flavor than regular walnuts. Sometimes they were eaten raw, other times chopped and stirred into porridge, or used to stretch a dessert when a little molasses showed up. More than food, they were survival, energy stored up for lean days and quick strength to take to the fields. Over time, that knowledge became tradition. Cake, ice cream, old-school sweets. And when the woods offered no nuts or fruit, the solution came from the garden, cooking cabbage stalks and cores that many people would throw away just to keep going. 20. Boiled cabbage cores. On the plantation, cabbage had an owner. The outer leaves, the prettier ones, went to the enslaver's table, but the hard cores left on the stalk were set aside as waste. In the quarters, though, none of that was trash. Those cores were chopped and simmered a long time until soft, turning into a thin stew, but hot, and enough to trick hunger. When a pinch of salt or a thread of pork fat showed up, the flavor got stronger. Most of the time, it was just cabbage and water. Enslaved families couldn't afford to waste anything. Every scrap went in the pot. Every fiber helped stretch the meal because every calorie mattered. Out of that forced creativity came a way of cooking that still lives in Southern kitchens, with recipes that use the whole vegetable and intense pickles, like green tomato chow chow, that gave some lift to dry, quiet plates. 21. Green tomato chow chow relish. When the season was ending and tomatoes were still green on the vine, enslaved cooks decided nothing was getting thrown away. They chopped the fruit, added peppers and onions, covered it with vinegar and salt, and cooked it down into chow chow, a tart relish with just the right bite. One spoonful next to beans, corn mush, or greens changed the day's meal, bringing contrast and energy to what was just fuel. But the point wasn't only taste. By preserving what wouldn't ripen, those families guaranteed food for the cold when the garden gave nothing. The jar held a quiet tactic of resistance that crossed time and landed on Southern tables at cookouts and Sunday dinners. And when even vegetables couldn't solve it, the answer went back to the ground. Roasted roots, ground up and turned into a bitter drink to take coffee's place. 22. Chicory coffee. When coffee was still a big house privilege, creativity bubbled up in the quarters. Enslaved families pulled up chicory roots, roasted them until nearly burnt, and pounded them into a coarse powder. With hot water, out came a dark, bitter drink, like coffee in smell, in color, and in the way it warmed your chest. More than flavor, it was routine. Something to drink before the sun came up and work began, or at night, when the body could barely hold itself up. It was comfort you could manage, a thread of dignity within reach of a calloused hand. And the story doesn't end there. After slavery, chicory stayed in the cup. In places like New Orleans, it became tradition. Cafes still blend chicory and coffee today, serving a sip that carries the ingenuity of people who had to make so much out of almost nothing, and even now brings anyone who drinks it close to that memory of quiet resistance. 23. Leftover bone broth. When everything had already gone into the pot, meat, fat, even what could be scraped from the bottom of the platter, only bones were left. In the big house, they went straight into the trash. In the quarters, they became a resource. Enslaved families gathered those scraps, covered them with water, and left them for hours over low heat. From that slow simmer came a thin, oily broth, but full of whatever the marrow could still give. It wasn't a feast, it was a base, used to thicken corn mush, give some flavor to small greens, support a feverish child or an exhausted adult. Today, the same broth shows up in nice bottles, sold like a wellness elixir. Almost nobody says it was born there, in the tight kitchen of people fighting just to make it to the next day alive, while roasted green corn in the husk closed out the meal. 24. Green corn roasted in the husk. At the end of summer, when the corn was still green and tender on the stalk, enslaved people would move close to the cornfields and take a few ears. To eat, you only needed the basics. Fire. The ear went in whole, husk and all, straight into the coals. In a few minutes the husk darkened, steam did the work, and the kernels came out hot, with a light smoky taste and sweetness. No pot, no seasoning, no meat, just coals and patience. Kids gnawed all the way down to the cob. Adults found quick energy there after long days and before the field was cleared. And there was something bigger. It wasn't just fuel, it was a rare moment of joy around the fire. And when night settled in, that same flame pulled the story toward the next dish. A thin but steady broth made from onion and garlic pulled from the ground. 25. Wild onion and garlic soup, almost all broth. In fields and woods, enslaved families looked for what the earth let slip, bulbs that grew in ditches and along the forest edge. They went into a pot with water and became a clear, sharp broth, too light to fill your stomach, but enough to keep your body standing. In a life shaped by hunger, the warmth of that liquid could change the day. The sulfur in the plants helped ease coughs, clear the chest, and reduce infections. For kids, it was medicine, and for adults, a way to get through long nights. When a little salt, fat, or pork showed up, the broth gained body and became a meal. Today, onion and garlic anchor kitchens around the world. There, their wild relatives were a quiet weapon of survival, and the echo of that choice still shows up in southern pots. That's the path the next story follows. If you made it this far, thanks for walking with us through this history. If this content helped you see food with new eyes, hit like, share, and comment what stood out to you most. See you in the next video.